Welcome back to TACvisor Overwatch League podcast. We have a very fun episode today. It'll be a little bit shorter than you're used to, mostly because the multitude of games that were played. There was really we want to talk about the semifinals and on and a couple other teams. But this was technically not part of the weeks as we normally post, but this was the May Melee that we are referring to. Some very interesting matches. Some teams that we didn't think would make runs did definitely in the Cinderella team and Seoul Dynasty. And how was your weekend? How was everything with the matches?
Um, for most of the matches, it was a lot of fun.
Sure.
Like there were some really good matches, especially especially later down the road. Like the later matches in the tournament were really good, with the exception of one. But it was aside from that, it was a lot of fun to watch, and it kind of gave us enough to get into without having to dive into 20 different matches. So
Yeah, some interesting storylines going on here. Just we'll go ahead. We'll start with the Asia bracket, and if you have been keeping up, or if you missed the May Melee, they broke up the brackets really based on where the team is located and not necessarily the team city. So when we talk about the Asia bracket, we do also have London in there and New York because they're based out of that area, not necessarily just because the team city is in Asia. So I definitely wanted to clear that up. But there's the North America bracket and the Asia bracket. The North America bracket being a little bit bigger and having a play-in, but Asia bracket, although be it small, definitely didn't disappoint.
no, and especially when you consider that we had a team in the Seoul Dynasty that was kind of showing flashes of being up there with the top teams. And going into the weekend, you heard most of the coaches and managers for these teams saying the one team we really don't want to face is the Seoul Dynasty.
Mm-hmm.
And some people kind of laughed that off and thought, well, I mean, they tend to shoot themselves in their own foot. They play inconsistently
Just true.
sometimes week to week. So how can they be that much of a threat? And we saw straight out of the gate against the Hangzhou Spark, who have been steadily improving, basically just get run over by the Seoul Dynasty and then set up a really good match with the Charge in the Dynasty.
Yeah, and that tends to be how Seoul plays. I mean, they either get 3-0'd or they 3-0 the opponent. And the Spark was one of the teams that didn't make it to the semifinals that I wanted to talk about. I was very excited to see them play a little bit longer in the May Melee because of the momentum that they had coming into it. I thought they had played much better as the weeks went on, and we've talked about it a little bit in the past episodes. But Seoul is so volatile, you just don't know which team you're going to get. And they came out, and it wasn't really close. I mean, I watched it. Spark wasn't really winning any of these matches, so and then Seoul, kind of moved on. The other team being the Hunters against NYXL. The Hunters have very much improved over the last couple weeks with really finding out what their identity is in that dive comp, and they play it on attack and defense. And it can be confusing for some of these teams that are used to teams switching up their comps and sometimes playing the double shield. And I think it confused NYXL a little bit throughout there. They still ended up pulling out the win, but definitely wanted to shout out to the Hunters and the Hunters fans for sticking with them. And I think that they're going to have an interesting second half of the season. But let's go ahead and jump into some of the semifinal games. First one I want to talk about is the Charge versus the Dynasty. Now, I definitely had the Charge winning this match. I thought they had played much better. I thought if they got ahead, got really any map wins, that it wouldn't end up being close. But Seoul really came out to play.
Yeah, and it was kind of one of those odd things. Again, speaking to like even the Charge had said that's the one team that we don't want to play. And considering how good we've seen the Charge get, and I know you've had them in, we both actually have had them in our top 5.
Mm-hmm.
We figured that, it would be a tough test since Seoul's catching their stride, but Charge just seemed that much better considering the teams that they have just recently beaten. And Seoul just came out and played rather fearlessly. They didn't worry about the aggression from Charge, especially with them playing the Zarya and the Reinhardt this time around. Krong played very well, was getting high charge rates, and the Dynasty just never seemed to be afraid of that. And they kept tight as a group. They'd focus their fire. They'd rotate their ults, make sure their economy was, set up the way they wanted it to be able to just go one after another throughout the team fights. And it ended up becoming a lot closer than I think some people might have expected.
Yeah, I was very surprised and a little happy to see the Soul play a closer match. I was a little surprised that it went to 5 because I thought that they would either once again get 3-0'd or they would 3-0. I was leaning more towards the 3-0 from the Charge. I didn't actually have the Spark losing that first game, so I didn't predict in the last podcast episode whether the Soul Dynasty would actually even be in this match. But once I saw that they had won, we don't see them win or really play in close games. They tend to either not be able to figure it out or they have it so figured out that they just kind of roll. So I think it's a good thing that they were able to win this close match. I think it gives them some momentum moving forward, especially, I mean, they have a little bit of time off, so it might be hard to keep that. But they have this momentum moving forward. They obviously figured something out. They beat a very good team in the Charge. I think they beat a decently solid team in the Spark. And then they go on, and we'll talk about the final as well, but they still played very well. But that game we saw their literal duality with that match. But we'll get to that in a little bit because that I'm very excited to talk about that especially. The Charge, I would say they played very well. When Seoul is playing at their best, they're almost unbeatable. So for the Charge to play against that team and still take two maps, which I think is in large part to, like you said, Krong and their tank play. I still think that Krong has been one of the, maybe he's not the best or flashiest tank, but he plays solid every single week. You know exactly what production you're going to get from him. And he did exactly that. And he was winning those tank battles, but unfortunately I think the DPS for the Soul was just too much.
Well, and I think it was not just a combination of, the Soul's DPS being too much. I feel like there were a couple things that were a little bit odd with the Charge. And some of it wasn't odd in a necessarily bad way, with the exception of the one that really stuck out to me. They continue to, the past couple of weeks, run Eileen with Nero. Mm-hmm. And while Eileen is a very good DPS player, Eileen's not on the level of Happy with the hit scan heroes. Happy is just a very, very comfortable play on McCree, on Widow, and even at times on Ashe, which is honestly a combination of those heroes in a way, so it makes sense.
Yeah.
And he complements Nero's style of play very well. Nero likes to be the guy who forces an isolation pick, and if he can't get it, you'll see Happy go in, clean it up, especially if he's on the Widow. He'll just make that flank move, and then he'll get the pick, pull back to the group, and then they just go back to work on the next guy. Eileen doesn't really play that way. He tends to get, I mean, we saw him play a lot of Reaper, so it fits this style.
Sure. He
tends to get in there, try to cause a lot of damage, and just get picks essentially the natural way by just putting out so much damage in a group fight. And the problem is with the way Soul Dynasty spaces and the way Bedosin rotates with his healing, especially on the BAP, you're not going to get those kind of picks. And so it kind of played into Dynasty's favor. And then the Charge kind of experimented with who was playing what on the tank. We saw them kind of switching back and forth on, Krong was playing a lot of his off-tank stuff, which he normally does. Mm-hmm. But we saw him play the Sigma versus Rio playing the Sigma when they would run the Sigma Orisa. So sometimes I wondered if while they seemed to play well, being able to switch back and forth that way, there were moments where it seemed like there was enough of that crack in the armor that the Dynasty could exploit it because neither one were playing the hero they're typically used to.
And they did every time.
And we ended up seeing them kind of make some adjustments. Mm-hmm. We ended up seeing them make some adjustments later on in maps, even including subbing Happy in. And we saw it be a little bit closer in the later maps. But the Dynasty just played extremely well. And a lot of it has to do with Prophet improving on his Echo. His positioning is much better. He's timing his duplicates right, picking what the team needs versus what's convenient, and making it work for the team fight, not just trying to get picks himself. And then best tracer in the world, hands down. We know what he can do. And he went out and he did his thing, and it went really deep this match. It went to all the way to the final point on map 5. You can't get any closer than that, but it was well played on both sides, and I think these are two teams to watch going forward.
Yeah, there's nothing scarier than Prophet with some time.
Mm-hmm.
Some time to learn this hero. We obviously talk about Rascal almost every week and how he's able to pick up these heroes and play whatever he wants. Even Hydration switching over to a tank and playing very well, considering that he's a DPS player. Prophet didn't pick it up immediately. I mean, we know that he's aced some of these other heroes. It was only a matter of time. And this was definitely the showcase for what he has picked up on that hero. And maybe it's from watching some of these other guys, but I think it's just that he's been able to play more and more and more, and he's starting to pick up on those mechanics. And the team around the Echo is now able to adjust to whatever Prophet is doing a little bit faster, starting to get used to him playing on that. And I think that was kind of the deciding factor, like I said, was just their DPS really playing. I agree for the most part that Happy should be playing in there with Nero. I think that he's a better overall, not better overall DPS player, but hit scan is, I mean, for sure. And against a team like Seoul that wants to get on you really fast, those hit scan picks that are early on, especially like Ashe, which we've been seeing a lot of Ashe play, because they can get picks, especially against those dive comps, and that was so important. So I do agree that it is a weird play to put Eileen in, and so I think Eileen did as well as we can reasonably expect him to do. I just think that the play style would have been better for Happy. So I agree with that. So the Soul end up winning that one 3-2. Very, very good match. On the other side of the bracket, however, we had NYXL, who struggled a little bit against the Hunters, but did eventually get the win. And then they played Shanghai, basically them just running straight into a brick wall.
Yeah, and it was only partially surprising that it was such a brick wall for them, considering the last time these two teams played, we saw a highly competitive 5-map match. Like, it was a reverse sweep for the Shanghai Dragons, but it was one that we've seen them win consecutive maps in a row in that fashion and make it look flawless and seamless and effortless. Whereas that match, there was a lot that they needed to do in order to try and get those minuscule percentages of difference in capping points, in capping payloads, just to try and get the win. This time, the Shanghai Dragons, it was like they were playing a contenders team. They just looked absolutely dominant. New York made decisions that I still do not understand, as far as you have every hero available. Mono's best tank is easily Reinhardt. The best tank for Hotba is easily Diva, yet you never ran them together. Your positioning was all out of whack because you continued to have Hotba playing Zarya, and you can see he's not comfortable on her at all. And it just left Mono basically out to dry. And that was something that Shanghai did a very good job of. They focused down the main tank, understanding that that was going to be the most critical play to just wipe the entire team in each fight. And that's exactly what they did. They, as soon as Mono would overextend in the slightest, sleep dart, shield bash, whatever kind of CC or stun that you needed, and they immediately just pounced on him. And then Hoppa has little to no defense because he's a Zarya most of the time. So easy pick there when he misuses the bubbles. And then it's just squishies from there. And it just, while Shanghai looked absolutely dominant, the Excelsior, quite honestly, looked just absolutely terrible.
Do you think
there's really no excuse for it?
Well, do you think that is them not playing well? I know that Shanghai has this way of forcing teams to make mistakes. I don't think that their playstyle was overly aggressive, but they did, they pushed the issue quite a bit. I think Shanghai thinks that they're the better team just about any time they go into a fight. So I agree that New York did not play very well, and I don't think that they were playing within the right headspace, or I don't know what was going on with them, but they definitely were making mistakes that we're not used to seeing them make. I think part of that is what you're saying, in that they are not playing the right heroes. I don't know what coaching decisions they were making, or if they just didn't feel confident, or if they were just trying to counter the other comp. But sometimes you just have to say, screw it. This is what we're good with. And that's what we're seeing the Hunters have some success with. This is what we're good with. We don't care what the other team's running. New York, it has a very set play style that they're very good with, that slow push. And against Shanghai, Shanghai really forced them to speed up, and we saw them make mistakes. So I think it's both that they were not ready. I think that they thought they had Shanghai maybe a little bit figured out from their last meeting, it being so close. Obviously, Shanghai adapted a lot better from that last meeting, and this really showed. I mean, Shanghai didn't make mistakes. They looked pretty unbeatable as far as NYXL is concerned.
And really, whether it was coaching or not, and usually New York does play a pretty steady style of play. We saw them be too steady and too slow with you have a Zarya and a Ryan. That's a hyper aggressive tank setup. You should be pushing in, leading the way to get that charge up for Zarya, burning through people quickly, burning down the tanks especially, so that your DPS can have their way with the back line and they can counter their opposing DPS players. And they played it as though they were playing their Reinhardt Diva, and sometimes they were playing it like they were playing a Winston Zarya, which is kind of a hybrid. And it's like you have to make up your mind on what style you're going to approach with. And the thing is, we've seen New York play hyperspeed with the dive comp, and they look very formidable.
They can run it.
But for some reason, they didn't play that. They didn't play the Reinhardt Diva to make it where their slow, steady pace was going to be able to be relied upon. They had no concrete method or play style philosophy in this match. Whereas the Shanghai Dragons, they just went with what they've always done, which is, constant rotations in and out of formation and playing with the heroes that they're absolutely best with, and just not being afraid when they'd engage in team fights.
Yeah, I think NYXL definitely looked a little scrambled. Like they weren't entirely sure what was going on or what they needed to run. And by the time they started to figure it out, it was too late. I mean, the match was basically already over by the time that they started winning team fights. It wasn't really that close. And I was a little disappointed because you have the 2 and the 3 going against each other. I mean, 2 teams that we've had in our top 5 now. Now, I dropped NYXL out of the top 5. I think that they're still going to remain out of the top 5. You can't lose 2 maps to the Hunters and then get 3-0'd by Shanghai and still stay in my top 5. So I definitely think that they have some salvaging to do, and they have that length of time, about 3 weeks now, to really fix some things before they come back. The good thing is this May Melee doesn't necessarily mean anything moving on for them, only if they won. So even losing this, hopefully they can just build a little bit of momentum back on and keep them going, because they are an exciting team to watch, and I do hope that they do well in the future. But that moves us on to Seoul Dynasty, who we just talked about beating the Charge 3-2, and then Shanghai that beat NYXL 3-0. This was insanity. I saw pure insanity. It was so much fun. I was sitting there watching it, and I actually was watching it on the replay, so I missed it live. I was watching it on the replay. Made sure to avoid all the spoilers that I could. I'm watching it. I see Seoul go up, 3-0, and pretty dominantly go up 3-0. There was some back and forths, but Seoul was playing lights out against the best, to my opinion now, the best team in the league, against the Dragons. Lights out. And then I hover over the video and see that there's like 2 hours left in the video. And I was like, oh no. They play for that much longer. That means that Shanghai comes back and at least goes to 6 or 7 maps. This was an instant classic. I think that this one match shows the entire narrative of Seoul's season. This is their 3-0 and then their 0-3. This is it. That's what we saw.
And to a degree, that's true. But honestly, usually when we see them do the 0-3 where they get mopped, or in this case, it was an 0-4, they usually just look terrible. They usually are, their spacing's all over the
It
place.
was
Their
still
hero
close.
picks are poor.
It was still close.
This was still very close. Like Seoul had a couple of opportunities to close it out in each map. So it wasn't like Shanghai just went, oh, we've been playing with you the whole time. We're going to go ahead and put our foot on the gas
Yeah.
now. So we got to give the Dynasty some credit, not just for getting up 3-0 on the best team in the league, but the fact that they were still like, even though Shanghai made the correct adjustments, they made the coaching changes that you needed, they still pushed the Dragons to the limit. And this is kind of what would worry me about the Dynasty, or not the Dynasty, the Dragons going forward, is we've seen sometimes where they are just an absolute dominant team. And yes, they win these close matches, but when you let it get that close to have to pull out the win, eventually that luck is going to run out. So they need to be able to assert their dominance early, like we see them do, and dictate the entire pace of the match. Otherwise, if they start to let more of these teams, like if they start to play the Philly Fusions and the Florida Mayhems and the San Francisco Shocks sometime down the road, they're not going to let them creep back in if Shanghai lets those teams set the pace. Those teams are just going to keep the throttle down and go right at them and close it out quickly. So there's some takeaways on both sides, good and bad, obviously, when you have a match like this. And especially if you're the team that wins, there's more good to take out of than the team that loses. But in this case, the Dynasty had a good bit to walk away with feeling proud of, and hopefully some stuff to work on in this extended break that we get.
Yeah, I think they should definitely be very excited that they were able to go up 3-0 against the Dragons. That is not an easy task. They've beat them in the past, as well as getting beaten by them pretty handedly. So it just, the match stayed close even in the final four maps. But I still don't think that the Seoul looked as solid. They looked amazing the first three maps, and they were finding all the cracks in the Dragons' defense and comps, and it just didn't really matter what the Dragons tried to do. The Seoul were able to keep up with them. And I say that it stayed close, but watching it, it just still looked like Shanghai was the better team. Like the whole time I was watching, I just kept thinking to myself, I can't believe Shanghai is going to pull this off, because they just continually looked better. And I know obviously they were better because they were winning the maps. But even on the maps that they lost in the first three, they still looked like the better team. It looked like more like Seoul was getting these picks early, and that was the only way they were winning team fights. But they did continue to do it, and that's part of winning the matches. I do agree that it was, like I said, it was a little bit closer in the final four. But I think that this match especially really tells that narrative of Seoul constantly either playing lights out or just getting rolled over. And once they lost that fourth map, they just couldn't really find any footing. They tried to, and it looked at times it looked like they were going to close it out, and they were just losing maps that not even maps that I think they should have won. They just were being outplayed. And that carried on for 4 maps in a row. 4 maps in a row. All you have to do is win one more. That's it. All you have to do is win one more. They couldn't pull it out. I think that's a huge blow to their egos. I think they should be excited that they moved on. They beat 2 good teams. They lost to Shanghai, which we've said is the best team in the league. But I don't know. Good teams in the league don't lose that map. They don't lose that match. They just don't. Teams like Seoul, they're so back and forth.
That's where I strongly disagree, because you've said that several times, and that is true sometimes. In this case, it was great teams know how to pull out those wins that they shouldn't get. Because I've got it rolling right here, just kind of to look back and make sure I haven't missed anything. Honestly, the Dragons really didn't deserve to win Busan. It's just the fact they got that 99-99 flip, took the wind out of the sails of the Dynasty, and then in the next map, they went back to doing their thing of asserting dominance. That was a great team pulling out a win, not a not a poor team or a bad team losing a map that they
Oh,
should
I
have
don't even
won.
think that they're bad. I just
So,
think that a better team wins that. Once they're up 3-0, I think a better team wins that.
well, and that's one way to look at it. But in this case, it was just the great team pulled it out more than the very good team lost it,
Okay.
because it was just these fights went so close, and Shanghai would get that one crucial pick that they're like, that's what we need. And when they got it, then they just rode momentum.
Yeah, Shanghai is very, very good about capping on early picks. When they get a pick first, they don't tend to trade a whole lot. When they get a pick first, they're very aggressive. I mean, they move up. They're especially diving on whatever is the opposite, whatever is the partner of the one that they just killed. If it was a DPS, they're diving on the other DPS. If it was support, other support, things like that. So I can see what you're saying with Shanghai was just the better team not losing. They were pulling it out because they're the better team. I think if the Charge had won against Seoul, if the Seoul hadn't played like they did against that, I think that match was another example of the Charge should have won that match. Should have won that match. I think that was an example of that. I'm glad that the Seoul won. I think it was good for them, and I think it made for an interesting final. But in this one, I think if the Charge had won and they went up 3-0 on Shanghai, they're winning 4-1. I think a better team wins 4-1. Maybe they drop one to Shanghai because it's Shanghai. Maybe they even drop two to Shanghai and go and win 4-2. But they dropped 4 in a row. I think that's really hard to swallow for me. It's really hard to swallow. I can see what you're saying, and I do agree that Shanghai is the better team. I think that it was awful of Shanghai to lose 3 in a row to Seoul. But that's how Seoul plays. They have the ability that once they get rolling, they start rolling. And once they start getting rolled, they can't win. They can't pull out these maps. And so, I mean, we saw the duality of that right there. But a hell of a finals. A hell of a finals. That was exciting from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm.
Very exciting. The other side of, and I want to say congrats to Shanghai. That they had a pretty solid road to get through there with NYXL and then the Seoul playing as well as they were. So huge shout out to Shanghai and their fans for sticking with them. I mean, from being the worst team that we've ever seen play to winning the Melee and with a reverse four map sweep. Congrats to them. Hats off. Back to the North America side, back across the pond. The dark horse that I thought was going to move on a little bit further than they did was Paris. I said if anyone was going to make it through into the semis that wasn't in the top 4, it would be Paris. They almost did that. So I don't think that my prediction was completely wrong. They almost did that with 2 close matches against Boston and 1 against the Valiant. I don't think the Valiant played as well as we have seen them play. Definitely. And I mean, the Shock versus Valiant, this was not close.
No, it wasn't. And I think a large part of it has to do with really it. If anybody is going to win MVP that is not a DPS player, it has to be Choyobin. The man has just asserted his dominance against every opposing tank, his counterpart that he encounters.
Mm-hmm.
And he has his way with the back line of every team. He just forces his way in, cuts off their healing support. And he's an off tank. He's not even the main tank, who's usually the more dominant of the tank duo. He is a driving force in everything that San Francisco wants to accomplish. And he makes work easy for players who are great like Rascal and Ons, who's coming into his own in some ways on some of these heroes. Even he's, getting up there with like the better portion of the DPS in the league.
Yeah, he dueled very well with Valiant's DPS.
He did a very good job against Shax. At times, he kind of let his guard down against KSP, and I think that's, a more seasoned guy letting his guard down against a rookie, because Ons has been in the Overwatch scene for a little bit longer than KSP. But he just did a much better job in the later maps of playing more of that, very good compliment to Rascal, who we saw switch off of the Echo. We saw him play a little bit more May and things like that. And they worked very well together to create the lanes for Choyobin specifically to just annihilate. And LA, it just looks like they're leaning a lot on their DPS, and when their DPS can't get it, they just struggle.
Yeah, and that's what we saw the last couple matches, even in week 15, when their DPS isn't able to get the shots that they are used to making, and their tanks aren't really taking the space so that they can get the positioning and get these picks. This is what happens. They get rolled 3-0, and normally, you can pinpoint it on one of the three categories: support, DPS, or tank. You can say the Valiant's tanks were just very much outplayed, which they were. Or you can say the Valiant's DPS were being very much outplayed, which they were. Or you can say the support, even by the Shock, was just that much better than the Valiant. There wasn't even one section that played better. They all played better for the Shock. They just all played better. And I know it always starts, if one isn't performing, then it's harder for the others to performing. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we see these DPS that can kind of hard carry their tanks and force the enemy team back. It just didn't happen. It didn't happen. The Shock have been playing just off the wall the last two, even against Dallas. I was very surprised they lost a map against Dallas because they still played very dominant. But this was a statement game, I feel like, for the Shock. They've already tried to solidify themselves as one of the better teams in the league. The Valiant have been playing well and slowly creeping up. This was we've been here. We've done this. We know you're getting better. You've got a long way to go. That's what it felt like to me. This was let's knock these kids down a little bit and remind them who the defending champions are.
And to a degree, it was that, but I think it's also just, the LA Valiant in their very first meeting this season against the San Francisco Shock got the win, and they got it convincingly.
Yes.
Because, they played San Francisco with, players that they've now moved on from, or they put in somebody else, which we've covered that in the past.
They're very adaptable.
I think it's now that the Shock have basically said, this is our lineup going forward. The next 2-3 times they played the Valiant just didn't stand a chance, because now it was, okay, this is us playing with what we're comfortable with. You guys are still young and figuring things out. So for me, going into this, I had no expectations for the Valiant to even get a map. I'll be honest, because I was expecting, honestly, Paris to come in and Paris to push it to 5. And when
Me too.
LA put out the win against Paris, I'm like, well, this is going to be a wash. The Valiant are going to get run Rupshaw over, and they did. And I mean, hats off to them for sticking in there, and they hung in their fights very patiently, even if they were losing it and they had no hope. They'd still stand their ground, try to do what they could to build up some ultimates, maybe try and get a pick or two to flip it and stall time for somebody from the spawn to come and join them. But the San Francisco Shock, with the combination of Smurf and Choyobin and Violet and Moss specifically, they can rotate the DPS to be Ons and Striker, Rascal, Ons. They can rotate that all day long. But when you have those specific pairings on the tank and support, it's just unreal. And the fun thing for me is we haven't seen many players come in and basically revolutionize the way to play a hero. I mean, with the exception of, we've seen Jonak, he revolutionized how to play. The Zenyatta, we've seen a lot of people, Alarm specifically, adapt to that and be a dominant player in the league. We saw Sinatra kind of reinvent the Doomfist to a degree. Most of that was really more Haxel, but it was really Sinatra because of the finals and the matchup. He won that matchup, so it was really more him. We've seen Violet now redefine how to play Baptiste. He's turned him into a true harm assist, and it is unreal. And the positionings that he'll take and the chase downs he'll make. Yeah. No one else is seeming to do that, but he's just like, listen, this guy has more damage than anyone gives him credit for, and I'm going to use it if no one else is going to use it. He chased down KSP on Ash on Hollywood and landed a headshot that I just still can't believe he landed with the booster pack. He jumps up, just lines it up and triple shot and just takes him out of the fight. And then from there, the roll was on. Just things like that show how, like, while the Valiant, yes, they're a good team. They are getting better in some aspects. They have a long way to go because of how young they are. And this San Francisco Shock team is kind of showing that.
Yeah, I agree. The Shock have been playing very, very well. And Violet, I definitely agree, has been revolutionizing. And I think that's the right word. I think a lot of people shy away from that word, but I think it's a perfect way to describe how Violet has been playing on this Baptiste. Generally, these heroes that do a lot of damage when they heal are the heroes that can do damage while they heal. Zenyatta being able to throw out his orb and then still do a lot of damage. Bap can only do one or the other unless he's just using, his burst healing, but that's, only once every 12 seconds, which can be a whole team fight. I mean, sometimes 12 seconds is a whole team fight. So the way that he's able to do exactly that, play the harm assist play style and get these picks and jump up and have absolutely no fear against these top level DPS, it's been very fun to watch. And I don't like to talk very highly about the Shock because they beat my Titans last year in the finals so handedly. But he's been playing extremely well. The whole team has been playing well. There just isn't a single department that hasn't hit their mark, and especially in this match, they just were just that much better. It's the Valiant are a good team. They're not a great team. They're a good team, and it wasn't close. Now,
real quick before we move on, I do need to correct myself. I had it written down wrong. It was Hanamura, not Hollywood, because I think I said Hollywood.
I knew what you meant.
Correct myself.
If it makes you feel any better.
Well, I'm glad somebody did, but they both start with H, so I can give myself a little bit of slack. But
all right,
Well,
if you think that we can give Skitch some slack, just say so in the comments. If you think that we should kick him off the show, just email me at
very funny
at gmail.com. Thank you for that. The next match was quite the opposite. Not in score, 3-1. Mayhem, it looked more dominant than I think it was. These fights went pretty quick. The team fights, right? That's what I think my biggest takeaway was that the Fusion and the Mayhem were playing very aggressively against each other, and maybe there were some trades back and forth, but generally whoever got the first pick, it was a roll after that, and the whole team fight was lasting like what it seemed like 3 seconds, right?
Or thereabouts, something like that.
Yeah, they seem like very fast. I love the aggressive play style from both of these teams. Mayhem want to flank with Yaki. He played unbelievable on the Tracer. That's what he's been doing. We've seen him flank with just about every DPS character that he can, even Junkrat, who shouldn't really be able to flank. So you give him an actual flanking character in Tracer, and he's been, one of the top 3, I would say, Tracers in the league just over the last couple weeks. I mean, what could Philly's support have done to mitigate the damage that he does?
Honestly, I don't really know if there was much, because Alarm played the same way that he always plays. Yep. Funny Astro is not. They ran him on Baptiste a lot, which
I think it's weird.
Kind of confused me.
Yep, I think it's weird.
I mean, because he is a main support hero, but we see a lot of the flex support heroes, or players, I should say, play Baptiste because they want to utilize that damage.
Yes.
Funny Astro doesn't do that. He's used to playing, Lucio. Yeah. He plays Moira at times. He does play Brig at times, and they kind of use her and almost in a main healer role, which is that's what makes one of the things that makes the Philly Fusion a pretty good team, is the fact that they are able to use heroes in unconventional ways at times. But Alarm was doing what he could, but Funny Astro wasn't really putting out any damage, and he on the BAP can put out more damage than a Zenyatta. So honestly, I feel like this was kind of the Florida version of what Shanghai did last year. It's their coming of age. When I was watching it live, I thought it was a much closer match than the scoreline would lead. The more I watched it, because I ended up watching this one 2 or 3 more times over the weekend, and because I was just floored by how good the Mayhem looked, it really wasn't close. We saw Carpe getting pushed around by not just Yaki, who was a lot of the times in the match. BQB was forcing Carpe to take routes that Carpe is not comfortable taking.
Sure.
We had Carpe is very much a flank with any hero, like what we saw Yaki do. Carpe kind of mastered that in his, the first season, and even sometimes in the later part of last season. He's very much a flanked style DPS player with whoever he's on. We saw BQB basically tell him, no, you're going to have to figure out a new way to attack our back line, or really just anybody, because I'm going to take the right and the left away from you on my Ashe. And then by the time Carpe would make a decision, we'd see Yaki go toe-to-toe with him and take him out. We saw Poco make some positional decisions that I'm not used to seeing Poco make. Usually he's very, very good about, doing, I call it the figure eight with his main tank. You'll see the Reinhardt step up. You'll see D.Va here. And as the Reinhardt shield starts to go down, he'll pull back. D.Va steps up, uses damage matrix, puts out some damage to kind of get the team to back off, giving time for that Reinhardt shield to charge. And then they rotate back because the damage matrix now needs to cool down and come back. And he would just be a little bit, he'd almost do what I would call the Meko or the Janu, which was just think I can take out anybody on any given match because I'm that good. And Poco's not much of a elimination style off tank.
Yeah, he's not going to trade with you.
He's a space style, literally space style. If you look at the Gladiators, he plays a lot of the same. He creates that space for everyone else to do their work. That's what's made Carpe's job. He's super talented, but what's made his job so easy is how Poco has basically, been there to create the lanes for him to get those picks. The sidelines. For me, this was just the Mayhem were just more dominant than I expected them to be, partially because of Yaki, but Gargoyle's Sigma was insane. He played a lot like what we've seen Void and Choyobin play on the Sigma. Very hyper aggressive, very, very efficient on using the abilities, whether it's the basically his shield stack ability, the accretion, and his rotation of his shield was phenomenal alongside Fate. So the only real thing that I thought was the one weak spot for the Mayhem was Fate's positioning. He would be the first one picked in most of the fights. Yep. And when he would get picked, we'd see the gap close a little bit. But those were the only times that we would really see it even close for me.
Yeah, I agree to an extent. I still think that I shouldn't even say that the maps. It was more the team fights seemed to be closer, and that whoever was getting the first pick was winning that fight. Now, the Mayhem got the first pick the majority of the time. So I agree in that aspect. It wasn't as close with the maps because they ended up getting a lot further on the pushes and obviously more percentage just because they were winning more team fights. It did seem like with their playstyle, it was being shown that they can lose these fights if you can get that pick early. And that's what we saw in the finals too. Not to go ahead and jump ahead, but that's what we saw in the finals with the Shock. When the Shock were getting the picks early, which they do so well. They do it probably just about as well as Shanghai. When they get those picks early, they don't lose those team fights. Florida Mayhem tend to be able to hang around or not hang around after they get a pick or they get picked. Once they get picked, especially if it's a support player, that team kind of falls down. The support, and obviously I agree, him getting picked so often was a big problem. Fusion was at one point very arguably the best team in the league. I think that this has dropped them down for sure. I think you drop a map to the Gladiators, a team that I think you should have 3-0'd if we're playing up to how we've seen you play. And then I know that Florida's been playing lights out, but you've got to take more than one map and win more of these team fights. I don't think that their ult usage was that terrible. I just think the Mayhem's was better. And I think that continued even really into the finals against the Shock. I'm still excited to see how the Fusion is going to be playing in the future. Obviously, are going to take this and hopefully learn from some of the mistakes that they made. But I think that you're right in that Florida just played better. They just played better. I don't think this is a case where it's a better team, dropping maps that they shouldn't have. I think it's just the Florida Mayhem have found themselves in the last couple weeks. They've really rallied behind Yaki, who's been their number one DPS and really the staple of the team so far for this year. They've really rallied behind him and ended up pulling out a very significant marquee win against the Fusion, who many had picked to be the best team this year. So the finals was, I don't think it was as exciting as the Asia finals. I mean, it's kind of hard to beat a reverse sweep with 4 maps in a row, but it was still a lot of fun, right?
Oh, it was an absolute amount of fun, and honestly, it was one of those. It was honestly one of those matches that it really was, in my opinion, lost by the better team.
Okay.
Like it was the better team losing it for,
Mayhem are better than Shock
for themselves
as a team.
I felt this match they were.
Okay.
Whether or not they are overall, that's yet to be seen, because this was the big question for the Florida Mayhem coming into this melee was, are they going to be able to match toe to toe with the better teams in the league? Because their success lately has been against the lower half of the entire league. Your Washington Justice, your Vancouver Titans, the teams that basically are, struggling to even find roster, like players to be on their roster, for crying out loud. And so the question was, can they play against the better teams? They came in, they manhandled the Reign, manhandled the Fusion. And for the early part of the match, they were manhandling the Shock. It was just once it got to the later matches, specifically that map on the matchup on Lijiang, there was a moment where the Florida Mayhem were within 1% of taking that map and going up 3-2 on the Shock. And they threw it away because of panic alt usage, trying to win the fight when they didn't need to. Now, you could say that that's what makes Shock the better team, because they don't make those kind of mistakes, but we've seen them make those kind of mistakes. We've seen Super throw away. How many Earth Shatters have we seen that man throw away just to get one player and end up losing the team fight? Yeah. And that's why Smurf has usually been getting the pick, plus Smurf's better on the other main tanks like your Orisa and things of that nature. And that, of course, changes the entire complexity of how they play. But, those types of decisions also shows that they're not used to being in the dominant position. They're not used to being one of the better teams and having that opportunity to make that giant leap.
Yeah.
It can be a daunting task. It can be a daunting task to be in that position to say, this is our moment to assert ourselves at the top. And they were so excited to have that opportunity. They just used alts thinking it was going to seal the deal, and they didn't need to make them.
Yeah, you can't. And it was only slightly apparent during the Fusion match, where they have always used these aggressive alts, and sometimes it works out for them. And it did against the Fusion, because the Fusion made the mistakes. Shock don't really make those mistakes. I think you're right, and you're right on it. They don't make those mistakes. So when you're playing well, Mayhem played well. But when you're losing those alts, I mean, that's huge. The Shock are going to capitalize on that, and very fast. You're not going to win a team fight when you're shattering straight into a shield. It's not going to happen. Not against the Shock. And I know that Super, obviously, as you said, has wasted some of these. I think sometimes he can be over aggressive. I personally like the aggressive tank style, because that's how I play, and that's how I have found some success. So I'm okay with that sometimes, when you think you have an opening and you can get that big shatter, because sometimes you do, and sometimes you can go. And I don't think that shatter is like this. It is a team fight altering alt, but it's not necessarily a game changer. There can be several ults that can counter it, but the Mayhem definitely wasted some of their ults, and it was capitalized by the Shock. I don't think that there was, once again, any area in here when the Shock was lacking. They played well in all 3 aspects of the game. I think that they did a very good job at trying to control what was happening in the back line. If you can stop Yaki from getting picks early, the Mayhem are beatable. And that's what they were doing. Either they were stopping him by getting him, just pushing him out, which Shocker very good at peeling. And they have obviously a very good DPS style support that can kind of back them away. It makes it a little bit more dangerous for the DPS to just go flying in there from the Mayhem. So I was still happy with how this match turned out. I think it's a very good learning experience for the Mayhem that they're not going to be able to continue to make those kind of mistakes and expect to win, especially these longer matches where they're going on. It's first to 4 and it feels like it's dragging on for forever. I don't think they're going to win those against these better teams. They played a little bit better against the Fusion than they did against the Shock, and I think that's partly just because the Shock is the best team.
Well, and I think honestly, the Mayhem can against the better teams, because while we saw San Francisco kind of dictate what getting Yaki off a Tracer, we saw him come in as Echo and just dictate the next map on Junkertown and dictate the majority of Lijiang on the 5th map. So we've seen them in one match make adjustments and be able to say, oh, you're going to take away this and think that you're going to shut us down. Well, that's not going to be the case. Those are the kinds of things that, yes, while you're making these mistakes of poor alt usage later in the map, I mean, again, whether it's mental fatigue or whatever the case may be that causes you to do that, if you're able to make the adjustments to still take maps, still be assertive, dictate everything, and force it to that point where you have to make the mistake in order for the other team to win, I think that goes a long way. And that's something that they should hang their hat on is, hey, we were in a position to be able to win this final. We made adjustments to do so. It's just we made poor decisions, and that's the only thing we got to shore up. And then I feel like they could go back up against the San Francisco Shock later on and actually win.
And I agree that this is going to be an interesting matchup moving on anytime they play against each other, and probably meeting sometime in the final tournament. I still think that the Mayhem were able to come back and play well, and exactly what you're saying. I guess what I'm really trying to say is just the alt usage has to get better. They did adapt somewhat to their flanking getting shut down by San Fran, and not the whole time. It wasn't like San Fran forced them out constantly. It was every 3rd or 4th team fight they were able to back Yaki off, and that's a lot more than what some of these other teams can do. I just think when they are losing those team fights and then they're losing some other team fights because of poor ult usage, that leads to a 4-2 loss. When you are constantly flanking, obviously people are going to be looking for it. Up to this point, it hasn't mattered. Other teams know what they're doing. They haven't changed up much as far as their actual playstyle. Some heroes have changed, but they haven't changed up much as far as their actual playstyle. They're very aggressive. They want to get on you fast. And other teams know that, and it hadn't mattered. Fusion knew that. It didn't matter. The Shock knew that, and they are good enough that if they can win those neutral team fights the majority of the time, and then they're also winning those team fights that the Mayhem are just not using their ults very well, I disagree that the Mayhem was the better team going into this. I had a hard time because I did originally think that, hey, the Mayhem could pull this off. I thought the Shock was going to end up winning, but I thought, hey, the Mayhem could end up pulling this off. But once it started going, I didn't think so. I mean, even with them pulling 2 maps, I think the Shock just looked better throughout the whole thing. They were just winning more team fights in a pretty handed manner. I don't think that there was a time during the match when I thought, wow, the Mayhem look dominant right now. I don't think that there was at any time during the match that I thought that. And there were a couple times where I thought that the Shock looked like they were just about to start rolling Mayhem down into the field.
And then apparently you and I watched a very different match, because just after the first map, because I didn't think going in that the Mayhem stood a chance. I thought the Shock with how they handled the Valiant.
Yeah.
And I thought that, I was like, yeah, okay, the Mayhem beat the Fusion, but we had a lot of questions about the Fusion. Most people who were actually analyzing did. some of the casters were hyping the Fusion up more than they should and had other casters warning them, don't do that. And sure enough, the latter was right. I just thought that going in, the Shock were the better team. But after the first map, I honestly saw a more dominant Mayhem team between the two of them and saw the San Francisco Shock in the next two maps have to scrap out fights against a team that, if they were really the better team in that match, they should have just rolled them. And to me, the only time that San Francisco looked like they were going to roll and did roll was the very last map. And that took them a long time to get to that. And it took one insanely lucky superhero play from Super on the Reinhardt in the room, just off to the right of the point. And if he had not made that play, we're having a different conversation.
But I wasn't saying it wasn't close. The maps...
You kind of made it sound like it wasn't close.
No. I just don't think there was any time that the Mayhem looked like the dominant team. Maybe on Blizzard World. I mean, a full hold against the Shock is pretty solid. But they only got 1 point. So it wasn't like that was such a dominant win. And so they got 0-2'd on the first one. They win 1-0.
There's two sides to every map.
Oh, I know. But they're 1-0 on the second one. They're 0-2 on the third one. I mean, they don't pick up either. It wasn't really until the fourth map on Junkertown when they end up 5-4, very close. Then we move on. It's 1-2. Okay, that's still close against the Shock. And then as you had just said on map 5, I don't think that the Mayhem were very dominant. So first
Junkertown was map 4.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Not 3. Yeah, but you said 1-2.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant map 1 was dominant for the Shock. Map 3 was dominant for the Shock. Map 4 was very close. Yeah, map 3.
Not map 1.
Shock won map 1. Shock won Nepal. Shock lost Blizzard World. The Shock won 0-2 on Volskaya. Junkertown was close, 5-4. Lijiang Tower was close, also. And
My face wasn't that Shock won the first map. You made it sound like they were dominant. It went all 3 points. That's not dominant.
No, it was 0-2.
No, it was 1-1-1-2 on the first one.
Nepal?
Mm-hmm.
Dude, it was 0-2. Shock.
Well, I could be wrong, but
yeah, Nepal. 0-2. I'm looking at it right now.
Okay.
Florida didn't even pick up a point. And I don't remember them picking up a point. But either way, I don't think that there was any time when I thought, wow, the Shock looked like, or the Mayhem looked like the better team. There were several times it was close, but there were several times where I thought the Shock just looked like the more dominant team, and that's the result we got. I mean, 4-2 is pretty generous, I think, towards the Mayhem. I think them picking up 2 maps against them is a very good boost. I know they probably don't feel like that. They probably wanted more from that. And I completely understand with the way they were playing, I had expected it to be a little bit closer. But this Shock team is no joke. They're no joke. So congrats to them on winning. And I'm just excited to see what they're going to continue to play, because they have, I mean, just this whole tournament they just played lights out. They've been playing obviously very well. They've seemed beatable at times, but they've really come together, and I think this May Melee definitely showcased that. All right. Well, there you have it, the May Melee. Shout out to the Shanghai Dragons and the Shock. I wish we would have gotten a cross-continental play against those two teams. That's the matchup I want to see, is those two teams just duking it out at the end of a tournament. Yeah, that I think that would have been a lot of fun. Now we have a break coming up. About 3 weeks. Which team do you look forward to seeing after the break? Who do you think is going to make the most improvement in this time off?
Honestly, it would have to come down to either the Seoul Dynasty or the Florida Mayhem. I think that those two teams are minuscule pieces, because we finally saw the big thing with this Melee is every hero was available. And we've seen that once there are no limitations on certain teams, they're scary.
Yeah.
And for me, those two of those teams are the Dynasty and the Mayhem. And I think going forward, they have a lot that they can they're not, they have a lot to work off of and very few things to have to fix to be up there among the top teams. And if they can shore up those little things, they'll be able to withstand having the hero bands back in play for the remainder of the season before the tournament comes around. They've just got to be able to make the tournament, which I think both of them easily can right now.
I agree.
And I think those are the two teams to watch.
Yeah, it's hard for me to argue against that. I mean, Seoul has been playing very well, and they seem to have figured something out over this tournament, and they have 3 weeks to really cap on that momentum. So I'm very much looking forward to them. I think the other team would be the Charge. Coming in, they were the 1 seed. They lose 3-2 in kind of heartbreaking fashion. I would look to see them come back a lot stronger and hopefully play better against these teams that I feel like they should be beating. I know Seoul obviously played very, very well, but I think the Charge were overall a better all-around team. So I'm very interested to see how they come back and play. But I think we will have some random content thrown up on the YouTube page. Probably not do full podcast episodes like this. Won't be too much to talk about unless we want to, if there's some crazy moves made over the last 3 weeks, we might hop in the booth and do some stuff. But if you don't have anything else.
Oh, I had a feeling you'd want to talk about your top 5 at the break.
Okay.
Before we move forward.
Sure. I think it's tough to, since these wins and losses don't necessarily affect their overall ranking. I'll give you my top 5 of what I saw in the tournament. I think at number 1 right now. No, I want you to give me your top 5 overall. I'm going to give my top 5 just from what I saw in the tournament. I'm going to put the Dragons at 1. I'm going to put the Shock at 2. That's very difficult for me to do because I think that the Shock beat a better team than the Shanghai did. But Shanghai 3-0'd NYXL, and I don't think we can overlook that in very, very dominant fashion. So I'm going to go Shanghai. I'm going to go San Francisco Shock. I think next is Florida Mayhem right now in third place. Hard to argue with that. I mean, they just played very well, beat a very good Fusion team. Fusion is who I am going to go ahead and put at 4. It's hard for me to do that because I really think you could interchange the Fusion or the Soul. I'm going to put the Soul at 5 instead of the Fusion, simply because the Fusion didn't lose 4 maps in a row. I feel like it's really hard for me to swallow that losing 4 maps in a row. I feel like I would have to buy a new keyboard if I lost 4 maps in a row like that. So I'm gonna put them at 5. That I think that from what I saw in the tournament, that would be my top 5.
That's fair.
Okay.
It's similar to what I say the actual top 5 of the teams is, because I feel like while these may not have an effect on standings as far as win-loss record, you can't just throw them away. You can't just throw away the matches like we tend to do with these mid-season things, because they do have a bearing on the mentality of the team, the philosophy of the team. It does have ramifications, even if you're not going to be, if Shanghai goes and they don't win this year's championship, no one's going to be talking about, oh, they won the Asian Melee. They're not, even though you're not going to do that, you can't throw these matches away.
Doesn't matter as much.
So for me, it would be Shanghai, yes, is absolutely the number 1 team. I don't think it's very close between them and the Shock. I think the Shanghai is far better because whether you want to focus on Dynasty dropping 4 maps or however you want to look at it, we saw more resilience, a higher need for resilience as a team from the Dragons, whereas the Shock benefited from, again, a superhero play in what should have been really, when it got to that 2-2 point, should have ended up being a loss. One man luckily got an insane shatter and charge off that even he was probably surprised that he was able to pull off,
Yeah, it's hard to argue
regardless
that.
of regardless of history. So when you see resiliency from a team like that, I think that that puts you far away from another team who had to rely on a
Okay.
superhero play. Shock is still the number two because I have more faith in their roster lineup when they run, again, whatever 2 DPS, but when they run Smurf and Choyobin, that's when they look the most dominant
Yeah.
because they seem the most patient. There's not this frantic style of play. And that patience pays off in a lot of those matches where it was a lot of those team fights where it was close. That patience ended up winning out. For me, three would be the Mayhem. Again, I think that they've closed a significant gap. I put Dynasty at four.
Okay.
Regardless of dropping 4 maps, they still push the best team in the league to their limit, even in those maps that they lost. And it wasn't that it wasn't a fall apart. We lost the map. It was Shanghai again, making the play to get that specific thing they needed in order to win said team fight or said map.
Yeah.
And then I would actually put the Charge at five.
Okay.
The reason I would put them at five is because we saw them start to what part of what put them towards the top just on weekends these past few weeks was we saw them running the comp that best suits them. We saw them start tinkering with that a little bit and still looking very formidable against the Dynasty. So they were still running, they love to run their Orisa and their Sig. We started to see them pull out some Zarya, some Reinhardt, and they were looking very, very formidable with it, especially Krong on the Zarya. I don't think I ever saw him really below 80% charge on the weapon, which is very, very impressive. We saw, better chemistry between Eileen and Nero. And when Happy came in, it was almost seamless and seemed to actually get a little better. And we've started to see Shu play more Zenyatta finally and see that he's actually not half bad at it. He just needs to do a little bit more work and, work on that damage portion of his game. Those couple of things, for me, that goes a long way when you can take what you're great at, tinker it a little bit, and still be very good at it. And you're tinkering to try and do counters. It's not just, we're going to mess with this because we feel like it. It's, this is what's being presented to us. We're going to put in the heroes to counter what's being presented, and we're going to make it work. And again, it went the full distance. That speaks volumes to the coaching staff and the players' resolve. So that's what I think the top five is. You could easily throw Fusions in there at five. The big thing is NYXL, I think, barely makes a top 10 at this point, and
it's tough.
Those are the two big teams that it's kind of going forward. Is this going to be kind of a continuing trend of Fusion where now we see them be bullied by other teams and start to lose more? And are we going to continue to see these poor coaching decisions by the NYXL and just basically lame brain play that just looks like they decided to stay home for the day?
Yeah. I think it's tough to argue with the top five that you gave. I do think it's a little bit of a slap to Fusion for leaving them out, but I can completely understand your justification for that, and I'd have to agree that the overall top five that you give is exactly what I would have given. Normally I like to argue, but that's pretty much exactly what I would have gave. So I do want to hear from you guys, the listeners, on what you think your top five is. So you can DM me either down here or Skitch over there at our socials. Mm-hmm. You can also send me an email at tacvisorpod at gmail.com. You can even tune into the Twitch if you want to discuss some Overwatch League. That's always down for that for either one of us. And I think that's about enough for me.
That's all I really had.
All right.
So I think
Stay safe,
that's
guys.
enough of that.